Before we took the break, we were seeking clarification as to why we were not receiving the gazetted bill. Inquiries have been sent to the relevant parties, being that the clerk and GIS, and I'm expecting that I'll be in possession of a response which I can share with the House tomorrow morning. In order to expedite the process, we will continue on with the debate. And I would ask members to please refrain from referring to committee stage amendments so that we won't be in breach of the rule of anticipation, and we'll deal with that at the appropriate stage at committee stage. I recognize the Honourable Minister for Education.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, giving a brief historical context to how we got here, I think is important. So both members in the chamber as well as those...
Minister of Education, may I just beg indulgence for a brief minute? The reason that I said refrain from mentioning any committee stage amendments is because the chair is not in possession of any committee stage amendments except from the member from Northside. That's the reason why I've said refrain. Please continue.
Sure, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the Education Law 2010, which is currently in force, was initially enacted in 1983 and has been amended a number of times, including in 1997, 99, and 2010. But, Madam Speaker, the only amendment to have been made in 2010 to the law, which is currently in force, is to make a change to the reference to the term financial secretary and substituting the words member of cabinet charged with finance in the third schedule of the law. So essentially, Madam Speaker, the only change made to the law since 1999 was that one name change or reference to office change. However, Madam Speaker, the Education Modernization Law put forward in 2009 by the then Minister of Education and now Premier sought to make critical updates to the decades-old legislation. However, the modernization law, Madam Speaker, was never brought into force. Madam Speaker, when we took office in 2013, the ministry was tasked to critically examine the education legislation currently in place, that is, the Education Law 2010 revision, as well as review the 2009 Education Modernization Law, which was on the books but never brought into force, as I said, in order to determine the way forward as it relates to the revised education legislation, which we believe was still very needed. And so, Madam Speaker, the revised education bill 2016 seeks to enshrine the policy priorities established for education in law. And again, as we saw in the memorandum and objects, these priorities established upon taking office in 2013 are reflected as being the emphasis of the provisions, basically, that is provided for in many respects in the actual bill. It also seeks to find a way to best support the education infrastructure to successfully educate all children, students, and clients in all educational institutions. And Madam Speaker, it also seeks to empower teachers, school leaders, and education administration personnel to deliver the best possible education for students in the Cayman Islands. Hence, Madam Speaker, the education bill, or an earlier version of this bill, was circulated for public consultation, and that is, it was the public consultation draft that was circulated in June 2015, and at that time, significant feedback was received during the consultation process. Madam Speaker, the public consultation process for this education bill took place beginning primarily at the end of May, beginning of June, and also during the month of July 2015. The main focus during that time was to have a press conference in June, which formally launched the process of having the public consultation draft available for debate and discussion by the community. It also included having public meetings held in every district, including Cayman. Madam Speaker, there were numerous media appearances giving the public the opportunity to participate in drafting this bill or impacting what this bill includes. They were able to do so by calling in to the various programs or writing in, with attendances on programs such as Radio Cayman's Crosstalk, Talk Today, For the Record, and the panel and various mediums in the media, as I said. There were also, Madam Speaker, meetings with stakeholder groups such as students, parents, ministry staff, Department of Education Services staff, teachers, school leaders, and the like. And finally, Madam Speaker, there was also a written survey which was available to the public on the ministry or via the Ministry of Education's website, where feedback could be given in written form. So, Madam Speaker, at these various meetings, a copy of the 2015 consultation draft of the bill was provided, and the discussion ensued about the proposed changes at that time. Madam Speaker, the public was informed at these meetings that their feedback could be provided, as I said, via a number of ways, either discussion in person or written submissions via the ministry website or directly to the ministry. Madam Speaker, this process, which, as I said, started in earnest from June 2015, involved wide public consultation. Madam Speaker, over 700 people were involved in this process, either responding or attending the various consultation forums, with, Madam Speaker, over 680 persons, the vast majority of them being teachers, principals, and educational personnel at the schools, at the Department of Education Services, and at the ministry, many of them attending and participating in the forums, and again, the rest submitting feedback either in writing or via the surveys. So, Madam Speaker, this proposed legislation is shaped and driven by local education expertise, as well as informed by students themselves, parents, and through community input. Madam Speaker, looking specifically, as I said, to the bill and what is contained in the bill is made up of 16 parts. And part one, Madam Speaker, deals with the definitions, some of the key definitions that will be used and referred to throughout the bill. And Madam Speaker, one of the important definitions which received some feedback from the initial public consultation draft was that of the compulsory school age. And we see that compulsory school age means commencing on the date next following that upon which a child attains the age of 5 years before 1st of September, and ending on the date on which the child attains the age of 17 years or has met the requirements to obtain a secondary school diploma or its equivalent, whichever is earlier, or such other age bracket as may be specified by an order made under Section 10. So, Madam Speaker, the parents in particular, when we had public consultation on the original consultation draft, felt that the compulsory school age should be extended to 17. They felt, and the government agreed with this position. However, it was also discussed at various forums that we need to take into consideration the fact that in some schools, in the private schools in particular, some of the private schools that follow the UK curriculum, students may start school prior to the age of 5, and so they either will complete the course of study leading to a secondary school diploma or its equivalent before reaching age 17. And also, Madam Speaker, this also makes provision for those students as it relates to any students that may be determined to be gifted and talented who may actually move through the system quite quickly. What we didn't want was to have just a age carved in stone and didn't take into consideration these particular nuances as well. And so that is why the definition is drafted as such, to say you have to be at least 17 or you have to have at least met the requirements to obtain a secondary school diploma, whichever is earlier, to make sure we capture all of the concerns that were expressed about people possibly leaving school prior to 17 without any formal education, but again, making consideration for schools, and in particular the schools that come to mind are prep school and Catholic school, where students may actually complete their what would be year 11 and get the equivalent of a secondary diploma prior to actually reaching age 17. So, Madam Speaker, this is one example of a key definition that is contained in the bill, and it allows for easier transition into other educational and employment opportunities by having the upper age range raised from 16 to 17 generally, which is currently in the Education Law 2010 revision. The age stated range is 16. So this is a change in policy from the government's perspective, which directly reflects the concerns of many of the parents in particular, but other stakeholders as well. Madam Speaker, Part 2 of the bill speaks to the duties of the minister and other governmental authorities. Madam Speaker, in this section, you will see that the duties of the minister responsible for education and duties of other governmental authorities have been expanded. And in particular, you will see that the responsibility involves determining the strategic direction of education and promoting effective implementation of education policy. It includes promoting the education of the people of these islands by the establishment of a varied, relevant, and comprehensive educational system for the purposes of fostering the spiritual, emotional, cultural, moral, intellectual, physical, social, and economic development of the community. It also speaks to establishing an education system organized, it being in accordance with this law, and directing expenditures of all sums appropriated by the legislature for educational purposes. Madam Speaker, the responsibilities also speak to the fact that there is now an imperative to collaborate with agencies to ensure the establishment and pursuit of goals and the objectives that develop basic knowledge and skills in all persons. Again, specifically reflecting not only the desire, but the need to ensure that there is collaboration on the part of the relevant entities involved. It also, Madam Speaker, specifically talks about endeavoring within available resources to ensure the provision of compulsory education is sufficient in number, character, and facilities so as to afford all eligible persons such opportunities for education and training and is desirable in view of their different ages, abilities, aptitudes, and needs, and the periods for which they are eligible for such education or training, and that such provision is made available by such means as the minister shall decide, including public-private partnerships or other collaborative arrangements. And Madam Speaker, this is particularly important because, Madam Speaker, it reflects in law the desire to work in partnership with private sector, with non-governmental, and other entities that are keenly interested and involved in helping us to achieve the center of excellence that education, or the goal that we're trying to achieve in that regard. And so the law allows for and creates the legislative flexibility which is necessary in order to really enhance any sort of partnerships going forward, to establish any sort of educational institution using the kind of innovative governance models or arrangements involving both public and private sector. Again, Madam Speaker, another key addition in the sense that what is reflected in this bill, which is not reflected in the current Education Law 2010 revision, the governing law as it stands right now, is there is an additional requirement to provide reasonable accommodations subject to available resources within the education system in order to facilitate compulsory education of persons with disabilities, and to take appropriate and reasonable measures to ensure that all educational institutions provide inclusive education to persons who have special educational needs on an equal basis with persons who do not have special educational needs. And Madam Speaker, this is important, and I spoke to this very briefly, or I alluded to this when giving my debate on the Disabilities Bill. And this is important because, Madam Speaker, this is the first piece of domestic legislation which has been amended pursuant to the principles contained in the disability policy, which the government adopted shortly after taking office, and also amended in anticipation of the compliance with the disability law, which was just debated and passed its second reading in this meeting of the Legislative Assembly. Madam Speaker, Part 3 of the bill deals with registration of educational institutions. It contains clauses, as I said, dealing with the registration of institutions, and where it seeks to prohibit persons from owning, operating, managing, and participating in the management of education institutions unless the institution is registered. Madam Speaker, this is important because it is, you know, the registration and making sure that there is a level of quality control is linked very much to the policy priority of raising standards in education by ensuring competency is in being able to carry out the functions of an educational institution. And so therefore, Madam Speaker, this particular provision was included. I also would like to remind the public about the issue of the development of and the implementation of the professional development policy, which was adopted for educators, and in particular for teachers, requiring the 60-hour per annum, which was something which was brought in during this administration. Again, ensuring that we put a focus on ensuring that our educators keep abreast with what is happening in the area of education and education delivery to be as effective as possible in their efforts to educate our children. Madam Speaker, Part 4 deals with school attendance, admission, and access to information. And Part 4, Madam Speaker, is about parental responsibility. It creates a positive obligation on the parent or the legal guardian of a child of compulsory age to see that the child is in full-time education, which is suitable to the child's requirement by either attending the school or otherwise as provided in Clause 15. And Clause 15, Madam Speaker, deals with the issue of homeschooling, which is not currently recognized in the Education Law 2010, but this bill does allow for the provisions of homeschooling. But again, Madam Speaker, the ability to homeschool is expressly permitted in the proposed law. However, homeschooling is also subject to the registration requirements in order to ensure that there is quality control etc. Madam Speaker, this part creates an offence for anyone who contravenes this section of the proposed law, and there is a fine which is proposed up to $2,000 which can be levied on each such offence. Madam Speaker, there are specific provisions in the bill, however, where a child can be absent without being subject to committing an offence, and those situations are outlined in this part as well, and includes being absent as a result of illness or recognition of a religious holiday, or a result of the child being excluded from school for a set period of time, or due to expulsion and not being given permission to enroll in another school. However, as it relates to the last point, there is also a positive obligation to take all reasonable steps to ensure that permission is granted expeditiously so the child is not expelled from school and not accessing education somewhere that is suitable. And Madam Speaker, it is at this stage probably important to reiterate that this bill is a bill that proposes to regulate and to govern education across the board. So governing education not just in the public schools, but also in the private schools. And so, Madam Speaker, these provisions would be relevant to all schools who are registered to operate as such in the country. Madam Speaker, there's also a situation or a provision where if a child is determined to be exposed to a contagious disease or for other serious health and safety reasons, the child needs to be out of school until the medical issues are resolved. Those are some of the instances where children can be out of school with permission and would be permissible under the law. Madam Speaker, this bill also gives the ability for the minister to close educational institutions under the advice of hazard management where serious potential health and safety risks are present as a result of a natural disaster. There is also an ability to close school temporarily due to potential health and safety risk as a result, as I said, of natural disaster, where it is impractical to obtain prior approval of the minister. So if there is a serious or significant instances where, for whatever reason, it's a matter of urgency, there is that provision for temporary closure in that particular instance. Madam Speaker, Clause 14 specifically deals with the ability to make provision to be offered in schools for students who are deemed to be gifted and talented based on the criteria established, and for provision for those students who speak English as an additional language. Madam Speaker, this recognizes, again, the need to ensure that all children are catered for, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum of ability. Madam Speaker, Part 5 of the bill deals with curriculum and educational stage and assessment. The current education legislation which is in force, that is the Education Law 2010 revision, is very limited in its scope as it relates to establishing a national curriculum, Madam Speaker. And the only references to curriculum in the law relate to that of supervising, revise, and inspecting a program of education and curriculum, and also the provision for non-denomination instruction, non-denominational worship and instruction. Therefore, Madam Speaker, in spite of the revisions to the law over the years since 1983, the current legislation fails to fully articulate the need to prescribe a national curriculum to make sure that there is depth and breadth of subject areas covered at all educational or all schools. And so Part 5 of the Education Bill is comprised of Clause 16, which empowers the minister to establish such a curriculum, and it recognizes the basic requirement of a curriculum to promote equality of access and opportunity for all students to learn and achieve well. Beyond that, it also recognizes that the curriculum should be broad, balanced, and relevant to the needs and interests of all students. It should promote the spiritual, emotional, moral, social, cultural, physical, intellectual, and economic development of the students. And it should prepare students for the subsequent stages of their education, training, or employment, and for the opportunities, responsibilities, and experiences of later life, such as being active participants in the workforce and productive citizens. Because, Madam Speaker, a key goal of the Ministry of Education is the empowerment of individuals to equip them with the tools to thrive and prosper in an ever-changing world. Madam Speaker, it is important that what is taught in schools enables our students to become critical thinkers, problem solvers, lifelong learners, and productive citizens in a global society. And so Part 5, Madam Speaker, and in particular Clause 17, prescribes these requirements. Madam Speaker, it recognizes and encourages educators and stakeholders in education, including parents, to hold firm to the belief that all children can and indeed will learn, and doing so promotes social harmony and mobility. Madam Speaker, it prescribes the structure of national curriculum, and it talks about subjects that are determined to be mandatory subjects. It talks about the assessment arrangements, and courses taught in the final stages of high school must be of recognized international standard. And again, Madam Speaker, some of the key mandatory subjects which would be prescribed as a part of the national curriculum, and that is being curriculum for the entire country, would be to include subject matter such as literacy, numeracy, studies related to civics, religion and history, and the culture of the islands. And Madam Speaker, this particular section of the proposed legislation, even in the consultation draft, elicited a lot of discussion, in that people felt it very important that we continue to keep in the proposed law and now in this bill, that all students studying in the Cayman Islands should develop an appreciation and an understanding of our Caymanian heritage, our culture, and civics, and what can be broadly described as civics. And so, Madam Speaker, that proposal was indeed retained, and it was broadened to include, as can be seen in the bill, all schools, not just government schools. And Madam Speaker, as it relates to our history and culture, by making this a requirement going forward, Madam Speaker, what it does is it actually gives an opportunity for the creation of Caymanian content, so to speak, in terms of the development of curriculum. We already have, Madam Speaker, to hand, there is a text by Mr. Ormond Panton, and for the life of me, the name of that particular book slips me. But we have, from the days of Mr. Ormond Panton, we have this information. We have books that we know that were written by Sir Vassal Johnson, As I See It. We have texts such as The Cayman Islands in Transition by J.A. Roy Bawden. We also have Founded Upon the Seas, A History of the Cayman Islands and Their People by Michael Creighton, just to name a few, Madam Speaker. We also have a treasure trove of information contained in the National Archives, the National Museum, the Cayman National Cultural Foundation, and the National Gallery as well, to name a few. And Madam Speaker, I had the privilege of recently being presented with the most recent Foundations Journal of the Cayman National Cultural Foundation, which was launched and distributed to all school libraries, and it particularly covers life within Cayman Brac and Little Cayman in that particular journal. So, Madam Speaker, the point that I'm making here is that by making this now a requirement in all schools, that all children studying in the Cayman Islands must have and must learn an appreciation for Caymanian cultural heritage and the Caymanian culture, it is a way to ensure that we perpetuate our culture and that our culture doesn't necessarily die with any one generation, and that people learn an appreciation for who we are, for where we come from, because that's really an important tool of determining where you want to go. Madam Speaker, another critical inclusion in this part of the curriculum as being a mandatory subject now for all schools, assuming that this legislation does indeed pass, is that civics is also going to be a required subject. Madam Speaker, as a government, we believe that students must learn what it is and how it is that our democracy operates. How does the Legislative Assembly work? Who are the elected officials and what are their roles? How are laws made? How does the government work, etc.? Madam Speaker, understanding democracy and how it works, understanding how to interpret political information, discuss political issues with peers as well as adults, family members or otherwise. Also being able to understand and make sense and process the information in the news, and also feel confident about their abilities to speak on these issues. This would all fall under the area of civics instructions or instruction in the schools. And again, Madam Speaker, the purpose of trying to ensure that our students receive a well-rounded curriculum is ensuring that they become literate and numerate, but also well-rounded and productive citizens in our society. And so Part 5 also provides a framework for rigor, transparency, and accountability for education. Madam Speaker, by requiring students to be studying courses that are internationally accredited, it promotes the ability of our students to compete successfully in an ever-increasing global economy, and it enables our local as well as international colleges and employers to recognize the value of qualifications gained while in our schools. Madam Speaker, Part 6 of the law establishes a department of government called the Office of Education Standards. And this office, Madam Speaker, has responsibility for assessment and monitoring of provision in educational institutions. Madam Speaker, again, it is important to link and underscore the significance of having such an office and how it would work to regularly conduct quality assurance to see whether or not as a country we are achieving the 6 strategic policy priorities which is enshrined in the bill, and in particular whether or not and how good we are doing as a country in achieving the policy priority of raising our standards and meeting international competitiveness in education. Madam Speaker, again, this, even though the bill now calls for this particular entity, this process was already kind of reignited during this administration when we conducted, and certainly as minister, when I called for the first ever comprehensive baseline of school inspections, which were conducted in the academic year 2014-2015. And of course, Madam Speaker, we've had lengthy discussions in this House about how the outcome of that assessment led to the development of a specific operational plan of action for 2015 and 2016, which has been carried over and now expanded upon to deal with some of the issues that are being rolled out in the 2016-2017 operational plan of action for education. And again, it was a plan, as I spoke to in the debate of the private member's motion last week. That particular plan of action has indeed been externally reviewed by a preeminent educator and has received glowing endorsement as such. So we know, Madam Speaker, that we are on the right track to addressing some of the key concerns that the baseline inspections have highlighted. But certainly, what this inspection process that took place in 2014, 2015 has done, it has established a baseline. So when this bill becomes law and the Office of Education Standards is established and really, has the legislative mandate to carry out its functions, it's able to measure progress and success based on what was established during these baseline assessments. And so, Madam Speaker, again, coming out of that particular exercise back in 2014, 2015, there was also the development of the Cayman Islands Teaching and Learning Strategy, which is the 5-year literacy plan that has the target set, whereas literacy last year, the target was 85% of year one. We exceeded that by 86% achievement, and working up to a 5-year target of having 100% of our year one and year two students reading and writing on level. Because again, Madam Speaker, going back to that fundamental principle of raising standards in education, if you do not set standards, especially if you do not set high standards, you will not achieve high standards. And so for the first time, we have had specific targeted standards which have been set, and happy to say the first of those standards have been achieved in that system-wide, as it relates to the public education system, that is, system-wide push to achieve those literacy standards set. Madam Speaker, it is also important to highlight that Clause 17 makes the legislative requirement to produce and submit an annual report on national education standards to the Legislative Assembly. And again, Madam Speaker, this was something that we felt was important because to ensure that there is transparency going forward. We know, Madam Speaker, that there has been issues in the past with respect to information being gathered, reports being conducted, reviews being conducted, but the information never seeing the light of day. And so, Madam Speaker, this particular provision makes it a legislative requirement that on an annual basis, in the prescribed timelines, that this Parliament and indeed this country has an opportunity to see how we're doing, how we're faring as a country when it relates to educational standards. And this certainly is a way to help to increase accountability in our system. Madam Speaker, Part 7 of the law, or the proposed law, I should say, the bill, speaks to funding of assisted schools. And Madam Speaker, what this particular provision captures is actually what kind of is already done in practice. And that is that the minister is able to make grants to assisted schools or those that become assisted schools. And assisted schools are defined as schools which are partly funded but not managed by the government. So, Madam Speaker, many, if not all, of our private schools already currently receive some funding from the government. So under the proposed legislation, those schools would be considered assisted schools. Again, Madam Speaker, the bill allows for Cabinet to make regulations governing the terms and conditions applicable to any grant given pursuant to this section and make different provisions for different categories of schools and different levels of grants to schools in the category depending on need. And again, Madam Speaker, currently the grants to private schools who, as I said, would be considered assisted schools under this legislation are governed pursuant to the purchase agreement with the Private Schools Association. However, Madam Speaker, as I said, this bill will specifically enable Cabinet to make regulations as it relates to such grants going forward. Madam Speaker, another key part of this particular bill is found in Part 8. and that is the part dealing specifically with technical and vocational education and training. Madam Speaker, the current legislation, the current law in force, the Education Law 2010 revision, does not include provision for technical and vocational education and training. But this bill does, and it includes provision for, I'll call it TVET for short, in schools as well as in post-compulsory education, so that is after high school, as well as it makes provision for subsidies for TVET to be delivered in schools and for students, either by way of grant or other means, to attend TVET programs. And in particular, Madam Speaker, I would like to read the provision in the law dealing specifically with TVET and demonstrating how we as a government are putting emphasis on making sure that this is enshrined in law going forward. Clause 19.1 says, in exercising the minister's power under this law, the minister shall have regard to the desirability of ensuring that the education provided in schools provides opportunities for students to have access to technical and vocational education and training. And clause 2, Madam Speaker, goes on to say, without limiting the power in subsection 1, in discharging the minister's duty under this section, the minister may direct that there be provided in any school such technical and vocational education and training as the minister may consider appropriate, and B, subsidized from monies available to the minister for the provision of schools, and by way of grant or by any other means, schemes, whereby such education for students in attendance at such schools may be provided in such places, including workplaces, as the minister may consider appropriate for that purpose. And of course, Madam Speaker, it also talks about the Cabinet having the ability to make regulations in respect to matters referred to in this section. But Madam Speaker, this is a concrete example of not just talking about the need to make provision for TVET, but actually enshrining it in proposed legislation, because it demonstrates that TVET is an important part of education for our students, and it provides an additional avenue or pathway for preparing our students with skills and competencies needed to take up employment opportunities in technical and vocational needs. Madam Speaker, TVET is a strategic priority of the Ministry of Education, and it's certainly a strategic priority of myself as Minister and of the government. And so, in order to do so, we have specifically enshrined this provision in the bill, which will allow for the further establishment and development of TVET programs, but also TVET institutions in the future to provide, as I said, these varied experiences and additional career pathways for our students. And again, it links directly to one of the 6 policy priority areas, which is highlighted in the beginning of this bill in the memorandum and objects. Madam Speaker, Part 9 of the bill deals with post-compulsory education and training. And it was formerly referred to as tertiary education under the Education Modernization Law. And in this bill, it deals, as I said, with the education and training of those persons who are no longer within compulsory school age, as defined in the bill, and those who would be considered in high school. But it deals with a gap that currently exists in the Education Law 2010 revision, because the current law in force does not include provision for post-compulsory education and training. The Education Bill 2016, however, includes a provision for the minister to cause to be established and maintained post-compulsory education and training institutions, including the Training Center for Adults with Disabilities. So, Madam Speaker, this section of the law gives the legislative support for the Sunrise Adult Training Center, which up until this point there is no real legislative underpinning for that particular institution. And again, it highlights the importance to ensure that we do have provision for persons post compulsory education, that is, for persons who have disabilities or adults with disabilities, again, underscoring the very important role that the Disabilities Bill will play, and law, once it is finally approved in this House, in shaping domestic legislation going forward. Madam Speaker, again, in this section, we see that the provision for technical education or technical and vocational education and training is specifically contemplated. There is a positive obligation on the part of the minister as can be seen in clauses 20 of the bill to ensure that this is taken care of, or that TVET is considered in the provision of these post-compulsory education and training opportunities.
Honorable Minister will be taking the luncheon break and reconvene at 2:30 p.m.